Hello and welcome, episode number 58 of Chel Squared. I'm your host, Andrew Chel, and as always, we've got a ton to get into today. Before we do, though, be sure to go back and listen to last week's episode. It's a special one. John Forsland hopped on the show and talked about his career, where his iconic phrases come from, and a bunch more great stuff. So take a listen if you haven't already, and of course, before we get into the show, the social media plug is in order. Please follow the podcast on Twitter at Chel Squared and on Facebook at Chel Squared for more hot takes, news by featured guests, poll questions, and a whole lot more. If you want to follow my personal Twitter, it's at Chelney Andrew. Please rate the show if you enjoy listening. It means more to me that I can put into words. Every time you like the show on SoundCloud, give it a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, follow it on Spotify, etc. It makes me feel great, helps the show out as well. I've ordered a lot of food over the years, and unless any of those places want to sponsor the show, I don't make any money off the podcast. This is done out of love in my spare time, so when I see a new rating or review or share or whatever else, it makes me feel great, so please do that if you haven't already. Chel Squared is a part of National Podcast Network, a network dedicated to NHL podcasts. Check the show out on there by going to nationalpodcast.network/Chel Squared. And though I'm a SiriusXM employee, this podcast is not affiliated in any way with the company. The opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and mine alone, and may or may not reflect the views of SiriusXM. I mean, I don't know. I don't speak for the company, and I don't know everyone in the company, so I may or may not. I don't know. If you're angry at my takes, direct them to me and me alone, please and thank you. It's the middle of the offseason, and while there's practically absolutely nothing going on, general managers make things interesting by making trades. He wasn't on the agenda recently or a few days ago, but I guess he is now. David Clarkson, or at least his contract, is on the move back to Toronto, as well as a fourth-round pick in the 2020 draft for Garrett Sparks. According to Cap Friendly, the Leafs are about $3 million over the cap right now, with Clarkson, to my understanding, being unable to join LTIR until the start of the season. The guest on the show today will help explain the math and reasoning behind that move for Toronto in a second here. Plus, the Hawks made a head-scratching, move last week. At least I think so. Shipping off Artem Anisimov, Rangers legend Artem Anisimov, to the Senators for Zach Smith. The Hawks shed about $1.3 million of cap, but was it really worth it for Chicago? Because I don't think so. We'll get into that a little bit later on the show as well. And this happened last Friday, but this discussion was paused, of course, by the legendary John Forsland sitting down for a conversation. But Milan Lucic was swapped for James Neal. I've gone on record on the show as saying the Neal contract was bad, but this is a horrific contract for Calgary, and it only gets worse from this point on. Plus, projecting point totals for next season, the poll question, and a whole lot more. Joining Chel Square this week is this is gonna be a mouthful. A writer for Hockey Graphs, The Athletic Chicago, The Athletic Toronto, as well as bi-weekly contributor to TSN Analytics, Sean Tierney. Sean, what's up? Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Appreciate you taking the time. You write for 4 different publications, as well as contribute data in your own Tableau and other places. Should I be concerned you don't sleep in order to make all that happen? I mean, I can't see you and vice versa. Our cameras are turned off. But blink twice if you need help, Sean. I'll send out a rescue team or something. You all right?
Yeah, it feels sort of like hockey data has taken me captive or something like that. I definitely can confirm I don't sleep much. That's a condition I've dealt with for a long time. And so, I've poured it into my day job, and I've poured it into this sort of side hobby, side job, side too. But yeah, it's definitely not a lot of sleep. It's a lot of attention directed in different ways. And it's funny, the summer, as you alluded to in your open, it should be a quiet time. But I think for a lot of, people who like to do hockey data work, this is the time where we get things set up for October, and we looked over the kind of viz we want to make and the kind of analysis we want to do. And so, even though the news is kind of coming in slowly now as we get into the end of July, there's a lot of work that can be done to get ready for October too. So no sleep in my future either, I fear.
For someone that might not know and someone that wants to know more about what you do, what exactly do you do in July to get prepped for October? What are the things that you have to do to make sure and triple check? And what are the things that you do behind the scenes that makes your data and everything like that great when you do post it?
I think the big thing for me and the big thing I've been working on is a tool that I developed just sort of towards the end of last year, a lineup tool where you can go in and enter your roster and kind of get a rough sort of sense or projection of how that team would perform. And it's kind of a fun tool and something, that had a lot of positive interaction around Twitter with it, where you can go in and kind of make that lineup the way you want to see it, or a lineup that isn't even realistic if you want to see how, something with Milan Lucic on your top line would look or whatever. And so for me, part of it is taking tools like that, making sure that the back end and all the data that feeds into them, is legit, it works. There's no name you can enter into the spreadsheet that isn't going to work. And then a lot of the other time that I spend is, I do daily charts during the hockey season, things that are sort of recaps of how teams are performing, how we should expect them to perform going forward, and players and goalies and all that. And so I just, for me, especially because I'm so Viz-centric and make a lot of visuals and graphs, it's a good opportunity to look over things that, during the season you can't tinker with. How does the view look? Does this really make sense? Am I focusing on the right things that a viewer might like? Now I can take a deep look at those and say, okay, this isn't working, or this is something I need to highlight, and I can reinvent it without the daily pressure of the next wave of games coming. So yeah, for me, it's kind of a beautification process, I guess, of the stuff that I do, and then just sort of testing and projecting forward as we get into October, because once the games start, you're kind of stuck with what you have a little bit, and you got to just roll on.
You have that awesome Google Doc for the line projections that you're talking about. I'm not a math major. I wasn't a math major. I took one math class in college. That was all I needed for my degree. My degree doesn't have anything related with math. Explain to me, like I'm 5 years old here, a quick little synopsis of how did you build this lineup tool? What goes into, I mean, you don't have to get into obviously the nitty gritty of how the calculations work and all that, but the basic overview of how you build something like that, because it's super cool. It's very intuitive, and you could play around with it and all. You could make any lineup pretty much that you want. How do you go about doing something like that? How do you build a tool like that?
Well, the first thing I would say is, and I mentioned it in the credits on the Google Sheet that you can access and that people, make good use of every day, which is really cool, is I saw something a couple of years ago by Dom Gallimini, who is one of the, most inspirational people for me in terms of hockey viz and how he put things together. And a couple of years ago, he released a tool that was a version of this sort of thing, where you could put in a lineup and you got a sense of how many shots they would generate per 60, how many shots they would give up. And you could do some things along those lines. And Dom has since taken that down, but it was really inspiring for me to see something like that. It's almost a video game style, an EA Sports kind of thing, where you can, look at your own lineup and dream it up however you want, change their ice time, and kind of get some real feedback on what that might look like. So for me, the challenge was, can I, find the right data to feed into something similar and build it in a way that is intuitive? And I really do hope that it comes across to users in that way. And so the data that feeds into it now comes from Evolving Wild. That's their Twitter handle. They have evolvinghockey.com, which is probably my primary site during the year for the data that I make use of. And one caution I guess I would throw out is, the WAR calculator, the WAR tool that I've got, it's really good for describing performance in season. And when I designed it, it was designed to let you know how your lineup was doing in season, and what if you threw James Neal down to line 4 and moved some guys around in the roster, how would it look? But WAR isn't necessarily intended to be a predictive stat, something that you take 1 year and you see how a player does, and you know that next year they're going to do the same thing. And so I'm working with, making some stretches mathematically where we're saying this is what the player's WAR score looked like last year. We know they're going to be a year older. We know that some parts of these numbers that go into it improve over time, decline over time, are unpredictable. You try to add in some extra regression, just meaning, what if this player, was actually just an average player for a certain amount of time on ice? How would that kind of level out their score? And all that kind of back end goes into it so that when a user goes in, you can click on the drop down menu, choose Brady Tkachuk, drop him into your left wing one spot, and you get something that, you know, gives you a reasonable approximation of how valuable he'd be over a full season. And so, I really do trace it back to the great work of Dom Gallimini, where this idea originated. And then it doesn't happen without the data from Evolving Wild, which is what I'm spinning off of. But their data they don't do the predictive side. That's something they're working on. And so what you're getting here is my take on all of that. And, I really hope that it's a fun tool that people enjoy using as the primary mode, and a great way to start a conversation about how your team's lineup is looking really good, is really going to suck, whatever, for next year, and a great place to start that conversation off.
I'm a big proponent of analytics. I love using it as one of the biggest tools of how to measure player performance. But some people out there are all about the eye test and analytics are ruining the sport, or the watch the games, which obviously, to do data, you have to watch the games. You have to you can't do data. You can't do data if you don't watch the games being played. What do you say to people that are detractors of analytics and just say, the eye test is so great and all that? Obviously, I don't think anyone is arguing you have to only look at analytics and nothing else. I don't think anyone is saying that you have to do a little bit of both, because there are certain things that you can measure, like off ice leadership, right? You can measure that on the ice or during a game. But what would you say to people that are super against analytics and are just eye test all day, every day?
I have a couple of sort of ways that I've handled that in the past. I think one key thing to say, and I think it was Garrett Hole, who's a Hockey Graphs editor from the past and still around working for a hockey team right now. It's like data isn't in substitute for the eye test. Instead, it's actually the extreme eye test, in that you take all the eye tests, add them all together to make sure you don't miss anything. And so the biggest problem with the eye test only is, if you really like your team and you watch, most of their games, most of the periods, don't get up to go get a snack, you really try to keep your eye on the game, there's a lot that you miss even in that scenario, but you still don't see the other 29 teams that were playing that night. And it's really hard to keep track of all those eye tests. The beautiful part about data is it's not magic, and it's not invented, from somewhere far away and disconnected from hockey. It's like imagining you could watch every single game and never miss a moment and get everything that happened all kind of condensed into the numbers that really matter. And so there isn't really a difference between the eye test and analytics, except for that analytics gets everything. It doesn't miss anything. And then we can decide, which of these things that we saw really do matter and which ones, aren't something that a player really was able to control. So, for example, we know if you know how many goals a player scored last year, analytics, or the idea of looking at stats, says that's not a number that repeats just in and of itself. Instead, there are other numbers that are better ways to guess at how many goals a player will score next year. And we only know that because we gather up all the data and then we look at it in some mathematical ways. And so my first line of defense, I guess, against that old argument is it's not different than the eye test. It's just all the eye tests all added up together. The second part, I guess I would say, from part of what you mentioned, was this idea of the intangibles or the off-ice leadership, or those things that anybody who's played a sport or been around a team, those things matter. There's that guy or girl on your team, and when they give that speech, it really matters. It riles the team up and you go out and perform better. Analytics don't deny that leadership or guts or grit or all those things.
Hashtag grit, baby. Hashtag grit.
Exactly. Hashtag grit. And there's no denying that those are real things. The game is played, or games are played by human beings. But what we can measure is the output of that leadership, how it translates into a difference in play on the ice. And so if you say leadership is one of those inputs, well, it's kind of hard to measure that without sitting in the locker room and asking everybody how they felt after that motivational speech. But what we can say is, if the leadership really mattered, we're going to see it play out in some kind of on-ice result that we can measure. So although we can't necessarily say the heart, the grit, the inputs, we can't necessarily see those, we can see the outputs that they lead to, and those we can measure. So, we're not denying that those things exist. We're just saying those are hard to measure, but these other things aren't. And if those leadership type things really do matter, we're going to see it in the on ice results anyway. So let's measure the things that we can. And I think something between those two lines of defense is usually enough for people to say, okay, I can see how the numbers might matter. It's not my thing, but it's not something I necessarily hate because you can see the connection.
There's a few people at work that I'm going to send that clip to because they are staunch haters of analytics. And I'm going to clip that part of the episode and then just send it to them. Be like, hey, look, analytics are not something that you should hate. They are something that works in tandem with everything else. So I appreciate you saying that because I'm definitely, absolutely gonna send what you just said to a few people that I know that are haters of analytics. You could say, well, one player that you won't be measuring their analytics anytime soon, at least to my knowledge, is David Clarkson, because he's going to be an LTIR presumably for the rest of his quote unquote career. I think it would shock me if he would play again. I don't think he will. The Leafs traded for him and a 4th round pick in 2020 for Garrett Sparks. This is a whole Pandora's box of cap issues and workarounds and loopholes and all that. I want to read something that Cap Friendly put out right after the tweet about the cap and the LTIR, which makes this trade a little bit make a little bit more sense. But I want to get your opinion right after I read this. So, and I quote from Cap Friendly, and they said, if the Toronto Maple Leafs signed Mitch Marner after the season begins and required the use of LTIR from Clarkson, which is $5.25 million, and Horton $5.3 million to do so, they might need the full $10.55 million in LTIR relief that those two would provide, and then some. As we saw with Nylander last year, signing a multi-year contract after the start of the season results in a higher AAV in the first year, but a slightly lower AAV in years 2+. For example, if a contract is signed in November at a $10.5 million AAV, the year 1 AAV could actually be between $13 and $14 million. The later the player signs a contract, the greater the first year's AAV. In Nylander's case, his year 1 cap hit was $10.3 million, was prorated based on 127 days remaining in the 186-day season, and the result was a final cap hit against the team of $6.9 million. However, under LTIR proration, this is wild. This is one of the biggest reasons why Cap Friendly is such a fantastic resource for people like me that. I mean, I'm a huge hockey fan, but this LTIR and proration and all that, again, I'm not a math person, so this is very helpful. Under LTIR proration does not exist. The full season cap hit is used. So if we take our first example and assume a $13 million cap hit for Marner for signing after the season started, the Maple Leafs would need the full $13 million cap space, which is greater than the $10.55 million cap relief that Horton and Clarkson would provide. Your thoughts, Sean, on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's wild, all the ins and outs of the LTIR and how this moves around. And like you're saying, I don't think, especially, the average hockey fan, I think that this is really opaque. It's difficult to dig into what this would mean. And I think, I was following the Twitter reaction as the Clarkson deal was coming through, and it was sort of just, stunning to see that the name, Clarkson's coming back after all this time. And why did the team feel the need to bury somebody else on LTIR when, they're already planning to put Horton there? And how does this connect? I think the best way, for me anyway, as I'm understanding how this works out, and like you said, Cap Friendly has been great. And Earl Schwartz was somebody that Cap Friendly retweeted who did a good job of breaking down the ins and outs. And I'd recommend checking his thread on the topic as well. The idea is that with only Thornton guaranteed to go on to that LTIR, not going to play next season for sure, even if the Leafs wound up right up against the cap, they were only going to get his $5 and a bit million in the LTIR. By bringing in Clarkson as well, now we know that they can get to about that $10.5 million mark above the cap. And so for the Leafs, this is just ultimately saying we're a team with a lot of money, and we're a team that can afford to use every resource available to us to outspend others. And the Leafs have shown this in their analytics department by having far and away the largest group of people working in their analytics department because that part isn't covered under the cap. They pay Babcock whatever Babcock wanted to be paid at the time. Money isn't an issue for them. And so here they're flexing that muscle again, where they can say, we can operate $10.5 million above the cap. And in effect, they're extending the cap for themselves, buying themselves the extra space to tuck Marner under. But it still does put a cap on what Marner can ultimately be paid, and Cap Friendly really breaks that down well. Some of those Drager numbers that have been out there where you get into the 11.5, 12.5, 13 million, that still isn't out there. It's still not possible for Marner, and if that's where he and his agent are set, then the Leafs are still going to be stuck and have to move on from this player. But as it stands, if they can get him in around 10 million or so, now they've got the space to do it with a full roster. And so, it's just the Leafs showing that they have Brandon Pridham working in their office, and he knows the NHL cap inside and out. And they found another loophole where they can kind of extend the cap for themselves. And, money is something that isn't an issue in Toronto. And so, here again, they found a way to operate around the cap. And, welcome back to David Clarkson, I guess.
This is an extreme version of weird flex, but okay, I guess, for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But for the Leafs, they get a 4th-round pick for next year's draft. That's fine for Garrett Sparks. What other purpose does this trade serve for Toronto besides showing the league, hey, we got a lot of money, which everyone already knew? How valuable was that 4th-round pick, in all honesty, for Toronto? Now they have 11 draft picks for next year. That's all fine and dandy. But what tangible benefit does this have for Toronto?
Right. So I think the big thing is this is all tied to Marner and creating the space needed to do something with Marner in the end. So the primary benefit is nothing to do with any of the players directly involved. It's, trying to get their RFA signed at a big number. But there are other elements that are going on in this deal. For one thing, Garrett Sparks completely face-planted in his opportunity as an NHL full-time backup last year. I do some goalie charts throughout the year that I update daily. And among backup goalies last year in terms of goals saved above expectation, which is just a stat where we look at the shots a goalie's actually faced and how has he performed relative to his actual workload. And Garrett Sparks was one of the worst backups in the league. There were only a couple of goalies that performed worse than he did. And so, Sparks had his opportunity to kind of claim the job, and he didn't. And so it wasn't a player that the team was married to anymore. The Newverth PTO had come out just before. And, there's reason to suspect that Newverth can be anything that Sparks could be, which wasn't much last year in the backup role. And basically, the Leafs have acquired another pick at not much cost, where, again, money isn't an object to the Leafs. And so they're able to buy a 4th-round selection in this deal as well. One sort of tangent maybe that I would add to it, and I'm sure this is something that the Leafs operate with the knowledge of too, is once you get into the late first round, draft pick expected value completely levels off. So the first few picks of the draft are highly valuable in terms of expected value, what we think the players will be. By the time you get down to 24th, 25th, 26th overall, there's less difference between the expected value of a late first rounder and the very end of the draft, like end of 7th round, than there is between, say, the 18th and the 21st overall pick. So what that really means condensed is a 4th rounder isn't much different than a 2nd rounder, and it isn't much different than a 7th rounder either. And so when the Leafs snag a 4th round pick, it may as well have been a 2nd. It may as well have been a 3rd. All those picks have extremely similar expected values, really. And so, you snag a 4th. Maybe Vegas thinks they didn't give up much in terms of picks to get this done. But it's a very valuable pick for a team that has shown, an understanding of that kind of expected value and a willingness to spend on who they draft and all their pre-draft scouting too. So I think it's sneaky in the Marner way, but it's also sneaky in terms of they had other ways to solve the Garrett Sparks problem, and they bought themselves an extra pick too.
Well, one player that you talk about expected value, and one player that I don't think brings a lot of expected value, and it shows in Evolving Hockey's graphs here, is Zach Smith, who got traded to Chicago about 9 or 10 days ago for Artem Anisimov. which that trade cleared up a little bit of cap for Chicago, $1.3 million. So the Caps, the Hawks right now have projected about a $3.3 million in cap space, according to Cap Friendly. Of course, the greatest website in the history of the universe. I use it every single episode. And their only RFA right now is Brendan Perlini. They have to sign Dylan Strome next season. He's going to be an RFA. DeBrincat, RFA next season. Drake Caggiula, an RFA next season, but I don't think he's going to get that much of a raise. And Corey Crawford is going to be a UFA. Robin Leonard is going to be a UFA. They have some contract decisions coming up for after this season, and they still have a lot of money tied up in Seabrook, who's 34. Keith, who's 36. They have a lot of money tied to players like that. But to me, Zach Smith, I don't see the value in personally, and the charts that Evolving Hockey has as well, they have him in the negatives for pretty much everything. And for Artem Anisimov, I mean, he's not going to be a 80, 90 point scorer, but I like him more than I do Zach Smith. And I feel like this is one of those trades that Chicago could have waited to do. I don't think they needed to do this July, or at least this early in July, and yet they did. What are your thoughts on this trade, and do you think Chicago did the right thing on this one? Because I don't. They traded Yoki Haru for Nylander, which is a terrible move in my opinion, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago when it happened. And I don't understand recent moves by the Chicago Blackhawks.
Right, and to touch on the Yoki Haru trade as well, just really quickly, that was a really wild one, where I see Henri Jokiharju as somebody who's definitely, the data projects that this is probably a top 4 defenseman in the NHL. He didn't have a huge sample last year, but showed well when he was in the NHL. Whereas Nylander, Alex Nylander going the other way, hasn't shown much in the NHL time he's received, but also his AHL data, working through Emmanuel Perry's prospects and draft data, doesn't project to him being an impact player anytime soon in the NHL either. So that was a head scratcher in the first instance. And I think the Smith and Anisimov deal falls right under the same umbrella, where I'm just sort of confused by what Stan Bowman is up to with Chicago. So the only rationale I can think of here is, like you said, the Blackhawks buy themselves a touch of cap space, and all that they moved out was a player that no longer had a prominent role on the team. The first couple of center spots are filled up. Anisimov is going to be third or fourth line, for the remainder of his contract with them. And he wasn't a player who had been impactful in Chicago. He had become sort of just a total depth player on the team. They found a way to move him out to get a little bit of cap space. It's quite possible that Stan Bowman also feels like Zach Smith is a leader. They brought back Andrew Shaw this year as well. And so, that idea of those gritty, intangible players coming back might be something that the Blackhawks are operating on right now. But if you look at this from sort of just a strict data side, my first tweet about the trade was, do I like a Dorian trade? Because, it feels like it's been a long time since Dorian in Ottawa has made a move that made some sense. But, with Anisimov's bonus already out of the way, he becomes, cheaper in actual dollars than Zach Smith to pay. And that's something, for better, for worse, in Ottawa, they're always looking for ways. Melnick's always looking for ways, the owner, to pay less in actual cash out to the roster.
There's a Benajad trade, prime example.
Exactly, where they're just looking to get the actual cash out of pocket down. And, Anisimov winds up being a bit cheaper than Zach Smith, but he's also, more likely to contribute something positive, especially at their age. One chart that really stuck out to me was Anisimov's shot chart, something that I make using data from moneypuck.com. And Anisimov managed a couple hundred shots last year, but his primary area for shooting is right in front of the net. He managed 15 goals on 19 expected goals, which is really good. His average shot distance is closer than league average. He's on target about league average rate in terms of actually hitting the nets with his shot. So he's a player that, for the Senators, especially in their sort of third line or maybe their second power play unit, he actually offers something useful. And, meanwhile, they're saving themselves a little cash out of hand as well. So for the first time maybe ever, I like a Dorian trade. And from the Chicago angle, I just don't really see what they're up to unless it's that hashtag grit, hashtag intangible sort of thing that they're operating on.
Evolving Hockey's graphs on Anisimov aren't that great for him either. He's on the power play. He's very, very barely above 0 on the standard deviation scale. On 5-on-5, he's not good. He's in the red for all 5 categories, which is offensive goals for, expected goals for, offensive Corsi for, and defensive expected goals and Corsi for. He's in the red for all 5 of those categories as well. So, but to your point, I like Anisimov more as a player that, one, could score more. Zach Smith, I think, only had 9 goals last season. Anisimov had more than that, and he has done that throughout his career. Zach Smith, not quite the scorer. He did score 25 goals one year in Ottawa, but that's not going to be repeated, I feel like. He also shot 20.7% that year. So 20.7% of the shots that he took wound up in the back of the net, which is a super high percentage that is near impossible to replicate. And it looks like the outlier here in his career as well. So it's just one of those trades for Chicago that makes sense, I guess, from a cap perspective, but I don't see how this makes them better. I mean, Zach Smith's, Anisimov's graph here from Evolving Hockey isn't great. Zach Smith, his graph isn't great either, but I just don't really see the point then. If you're, again, to me, this trade could have been made, not now. This could have waited. I don't know why they chose to do it right this second, 10 days ago.
Yeah, and I agree. The timing is kind of odd. It maybe, we talked earlier about sort of that human element that goes on with hockey. And, if Stan Bowman had a trip planned for August and he's cleaning up all his business before he leaves the office, maybe you force your trades through that could have waited or see if there's a better offer. But it seems like, as you said, Zach Smith didn't light the world on fire. He was better than only Pajot and Pyatt in Ottawa last year in terms of Evolving Hockey's WAR score. Anisimov wasn't good either. And so, the Blackhawks save a little off the cap. The Sens save a little bit out of cash, actually out of their pockets. And the deal might have been that simple, where you're just looking at a couple of players that are basically expendable on rosters. One team saves some cap and one team saves some money out of hand. And maybe it was only that deep before Bowman headed off on his August vacation. But aside from that, it's not an inspired move for either team. Nobody gets much better doing it. I'd rather be probably on Ottawa's side of it, just knowing that Zach Smith at his age is only going to get worse and was already really brutal. But neither of these teams get notably better here. So it's not even a lose-lose deal. It's this deal will disappear and we'll forget it happened. And then October on opening night, we'll be stunned when we see, Anisimov skate out there in an Ottawa Senators jersey because it's just, come back that this meaningless deal kind of happened.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room here in terms of trades that I don't get it. I don't understand this trade for Calgary. James Neal sent off to Edmonton, and they get Milan Lucic in return. Edmonton retains 12.5%, which is $750,000 of his $5.25 mil cap hit, and they also get a conditional 2020 third-round draft pick, which this is the strangest. This is one of the strangest conditions I've ever seen in a trade. The pick is transferred. This is according to Cap Friendly, of course, the greatest website in the history of the universe. Pick is transferred if James Neal scores 21 goals and Milan Lucic scores 10 or fewer goals than James Neal. First of all, I want to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. All right, we'll give you James Neal, but we want a draft pick. And then the conversation is from Kenny Holland is like, oh well, we'll give you the pick, but we'll have to figure out the goals scored. That conversation must have been ridiculous. But for Calgary, I don't get it. I really don't get it. James Neal didn't shoot well last season, and I think that if he plays in the top 6, which I have a feeling that he will, because, who else are they going to put on the top six? James Neal is going to have a sort of resurgence in offense, right? Playing with McDavid, playing with Draisaitl is going to have some sort of offensive boost there. Milan Lucic is I think Dim Filipovic put it best, where his no trade clause was his style of play. I mean, Milan Lucic isn't going to be a scorer. He can't really skate anymore, and he has a big contract. What was Calgary thinking on this one? I don't think it gets better here for Calgary. For Edmonton, they get out of a bad contract. James Neal doesn't have a great contract either, but at least he's not Milan Lucic. This doesn't make any sense for me if I'm a Calgary fan.
Yeah, and I can't help there either. I see the logic on Edmonton's side of this far clearer than I see what Calgary was up to. I hate when I get myself cornered into the position of saying I think a team was operating on intangibles, because it's kind of that catch-all for I don't understand what they were thinking. But I saw tweets in the reaction right after saying everybody on the ice is a lot taller now that Lucic is in Calgary, and that kind of thing. And that's really the only way you can rationalize it from that angle. I think maybe the only sort of tidbit I can throw at it is, as part of my War Lineup Creator tool and as part of my sort of series of tweeting out teams and my projected points for them for next season, I actually had Neal projected to hurt Calgary more than Lucic was projected to hurt Edmonton. It was slight, and they were both negative, but I did have Neal coming out, as a slightly worse contributor. So there is that. And Kent Wilson, who's one of my favorite Calgary Flame follows on Twitter, has been really clear about saying that it can't be understated just how bad James Neal was last year, that he was clearly Calgary's worst skater on the ice every single night. He had his opportunities with the top line. It wasn't going to work, and the fit became toxic. But it really must have been such a toxic situation that they were willing to take on one of the only contracts out there much worse than his in the Lucic deal. For me, if you're Edmonton, you're getting a player who has a track record of 20 goals or more in his career. He's had one bad year when Lucic has, sort of descended into several seasons of not being productive. And, anytime you got Connor McDavid, he's kind of that ultimate eject button where you can say, we're going to put a proven scorer on Connor McDavid's wing, and maybe we're going to get something out of this. So, if you're Edmonton, you're thinking proven goal scorer, give our star somebody who can ride shotgun and really convert. And Lucic wasn't that player, was never going to be that player again. In the end here, we're looking at a couple of 31-year-olds with crummy contracts and a couple of teams that, maybe didn't really make too much difference for themselves in swapping these couple of deals. But, Edmonton's got that chance that maybe James Neal bounces back in this season. I'm still kind of hesitant. Anytime you're looking at a post-30-year-old player counting on a bounce back, I think that's a recipe for heartbreak. But, I would take Neal over Lucic, that's for sure.
Well, James Neal's single-season analytics on evolvinghockey.com do not paint a good picture of the year he had last season. His last 3 years were just under league average, but last season was abysmal in Calgary. That's, no one sugarcoating the fact that James Neal did not have a good year in Calgary, but the idea that Milan Lucic is somehow going to improve while James Neal's not going to bounce back from a bad year, I don't know. Obviously it's it's the end of July, and no games are being played, so we could talk about how we could predict as much as we want, but until players get on the ice, we don't know for sure. But I feel like in this situation, we kind of do know for sure that Milan Lucic isn't the same Boston Bruin Milan Lucic that perhaps the Edmonton Oilers would have liked to see, and that didn't happen clearly. And the Calgary Flames kind of went a little crazy signing James Neal to that ridiculous contract, and that didn't work out either. So this is just two contracts that neither of which worked out. But for Calgary, they got destroyed by Colorado, And I don't. This trade doesn't help them. If they face Colorado in the first round again in the playoffs like they did this year, this doesn't help them at all. James Neal wasn't great, but Milan Lucic isn't gonna help them in the playoffs. This is not a trade that makes sense. I mean, they get a third round pick potentially with some ridiculous strings attached that I've never seen before in my life prior to this trade. But overall, I agree with you. This is just weird. There's no other word that you could describe this trade as besides this is strange for Calgary. For Edmonton, it makes sense, at least more so. For Calgary, this doesn't make any sense.
No, and again, I try to resist the urge to say, intangibles in these explanations, but you really do wonder, had it become something in the locker room with James Neal where you just couldn't bring him back next season, and even though a bounce back offensively is possible in theory, something, in the room, it just couldn't be. It just couldn't be that he returned. And when you go shopping that James Neal contract around the league, you know that you're looking at Milan Lucic, Louis Eriksson. You're looking at bad deals out there. And if he can't come back and you're stuck making a move, maybe Brad Treliving just got stuck with this as his only out. But it's a really, really dangerous way to get out of that deal. And I forget exactly the stipulations with the Lucic deal, but the idea that you could buy out the James Neal contract if you had to, it's still possible. But Lucic is just kind of a bulletproof contract. You can't get out in the same way from that deal. So, they're stuck to the kind of player that suited an NHL that isn't the way the game is played anymore. And I just don't see how you can anticipate that a 31-year-old going into his 32-year-old season, we know what aging curves do to players, and I think Lucic and Neal are both going to be worse next year. They're definitely not good bets to be, notably better. And it's a couple of teams stuck with awful contracts, but I guess they get to look at a new face next year.
Well, this leads me into my poll question that I put out earlier today, which was, which team will surprise and exceed expectations the most in the 2019-20 season? If you want to vote in the poll, if you want to tweet at the poll, it's at Chel Squared on Twitter. And this got over 530 votes. Sean, if you could retweet all of my polls from now on, that'd be fantastic. Because I mean, this is a lot of votes. This is a lot more than I'm used to getting. So I appreciate you, one, retweeting that, and two, getting all these votes. This is very helpful. And the four options were the Rangers, the Sabres, the Canucks, and the Blackhawks. You can only put four options on there. I wanted to put more, and Twitter only lets you put four. So out of these four options, which of the four do you think is the team that will surprise and exceed expectations the most next season?
Right, and the poll's a really interesting one with the four teams that you chose. So I'll take my sort of medium length answer with this. I think the Rangers have been, sort of applauded for the way that they were rebuilding their roster. They really, sort of took care of some of their bad contracts. They cleaned up their cap sheet. They seem to be collecting some young players. And I think people were, in general, sort of supportive or, applauded the way that Jeff Gordon was going about rebuilding that roster. And then they kind of shifted into this, warp speed ahead, get Panarin, get Trouba. We're a team that's, back in the mix. And when I do my projections for the rosters for next year, and, again, it's early, it's July, there's lots of things to shake free, and I don't look at my own, projections or numbers as any sort of hockey Bible. All sorts of, things can break in all sorts of directions. But when I project the Rangers, I've got them as a bottom five team right now, sort of projected in around the 76 to maybe as high as 80-point range. And I don't think that that's the message that the Panarin and Trouba contracts specifically, I don't think that's the message those contracts send. And so I see them as a team that's going to surprise, but in the wrong direction. I think it looks like they're going for it, but they're a team with no bottom six. There's a lot of holes on defense still, and they're counting on, maybe my favorite goalie, Henrik Lundqvist, to continue to defy time. And that's really dangerous to do with your number one goalie. So I see them as a team that will surprise but not exceed expectations, sort of going by your poll. The Sabres are a similar story where I think they've made a lot of really smart looking moves this summer. I've liked the things that they've done. The Skinner contract is fine. It's a lot of money, but he's a proven scorer, and you're not going to substitute somebody else in for him. I like some of the other moves they made on defense. Bringing in Miller was really handy. I think Yoki Harju plays for them next year and is going to be at least an NHL capable defender, which they need. The Ristolainen deal is still something that hasn't happened yet, but we all think will happen. So I see this team getting better, but I see them right around the Rangers in that sort of sub 80 point, maybe as high as 80 points range, and not getting back into the playoff picture yet, despite making a bunch of good moves. They were just so far out. So that leaves us with the Canucks and Blackhawks. And if I'm picking between those, I feel like the Blackhawks think that they're a playoff team again. They've brought in some of those gritty names that we already touched on with Zach Smith and Andrew Shaw. They brought in Robin Lehner, who was, unworldly fantastic last year. But I still don't see that roster as a complete roster. And I see it as a roster that's relying on a lot of old players to continue to be great and a goalie who had sort of just this crazy anomaly season. I've got the Blackhawks projected to be a playoff bubble team. And I think that's definitely the high end. I don't feel positive about my projection there, but I have to leave it the way the formula pumps it out. So for me, that leaves kind of process of elimination. I think the Canucks wind up being the most interesting one for me of the four. They've got 1,000 depth players signed right now, and so how does that actually play out in the end? I'm not totally sure. Like the likes of Tanner Pearson, where that shakes out. When I project their roster forward with Cap Friendly's likely line combinations, I really like some of what they've going on. I have them only projected at about 88 points right now, but I think that Jacob Markstrom is a good goalie who can repeat some of the success that he had last year. I'm high on Quinn Hughes coming in and making a difference. I like Jordy Ben. I think that that's a quiet but solid move for the depth of their defense. And then, that with Elias Peterson hanging out in the top line and Brock Besser, JT Miller is a good player still who should contribute positively. Michael Furland is, they wound up getting him at an okay rate, actually, for, the hype that was around his name early on. There's a lot of pieces in the roster that look really positive. I see them as a team that might just hang around the West playoff bubble, especially because the West looks kind of like a mess. I think that considering how bad it was last year for the Canucks, they're the team that I think might surprise and be a lot closer to contending this year, especially if Pettersson turns into that star that he really looked like in the first half of the year. If you get a really inspired full season from him, it's a team that's going to wind up kind of hanging around the playoff mix again all of a sudden, despite some of the turmoil from last year.
What's interesting? I just saw this on my timeline. Someone posted using your using the War lineup creator on Google Docs for the Rangers, and they got a little sign happy. They signed Joe Thornton probably to a 1 year, minimum deal or something like that, and they also signed Brendan Gaunce to, I would also assume, a 1 year minimum deal. And their Rangers lineup is Panarin, Zibanejad, Kakko, Kreider, Hedel, Buchnevich, Lemieux, Thornton, and Kravtsov, and Gauntz, Howard, and Jesper Foss on offense. And then you got Shea D'Angelo, Hayek, and Trouba, Shattenkirk, and Adam Fox as the six defensemen, so Mark Stahl out of the equation, and Lundqvist and Georgiev as the goaltenders. Now, with that lineup, that tool projects 98 points in the standings. So this is a little out there, and you have to sign these guys, and obviously this is as you mentioned earlier, this is not a great projection tool. So this is also based on Joe Thornton in the past, as we saw, not the same Joe Thornton that we'll probably see next year, but that just something to keep in mind. Is something that could very well happen, and that's interesting to keep in mind as well. And I put the Rangers in there in the poll because they also have Lundqvist still, they have Georgiev, they also brought in Shesterkin from Russia, who was lights out, the best one, or either the best or the second best behind Sorokin, young goaltender in the KHL. last year and the years before that as well. He has been absolutely incredible. He's been touted as the heir apparent to the throne that Henrik Lundqvist currently sits on, but won't be sitting on for much longer. His contract is up in 2 years, and I would assume that is probably the end of Lundqvist's playing career. So my estimation is that Shesterkin will be either fighting for the backup spot or will be fighting for the starting role. Georgiev was incredible for periods of time. There were some stretches where he looked human and this and that because the defense was atrocious in front of him. There's only so much he could do. But for the most part, he looked very good in net. So there's more answers right now in for the Rangers than questions. And I'm a Rangers fan, so this is going to be a little biased. I don't think they're going to be a 98-point team, but I do think they might be better than 78, 80 points. Are they going to be a playoff team? Probably not. They probably will take one more year to retool and fix the holes that they have, and then take that into the 2020-21 season. But as of right now, I don't think they're going to make the playoffs. But I do think they might get more than 80 points. Maybe not by much, maybe 84, 85. They might be in the hunt for a little bit, but they might fall off. But I do think they'll get a little bit higher than 78, 70, 76 or something like that. For the Sabres, I mean, for this poll, I picked teams that didn't make the playoffs last year. And right off the bat there weren't a whole lot of teams that I got to choose from that didn't have any expectations, right? Like the Kings obviously are rebuilding. They're not going to do anything next year. The Ducks aren't going to do anything. The Oilers are probably not making the playoffs again. Arizona was one team that I thought about putting in there that I didn't because they got Phil Kessel and they got so much better, and I feel like with Ranta now being healthy, they have a legitimate shot at not only a contending spot, but maybe even one of the top spots in the Pacific. And one person tends to agree with me is at Stan Huanpaa. I can't pronounce that last name. Juan Pa. I'm trying my best here. Sorry if I mispronounced it. But he said of these options, the Rangers, but the real answer is the Coyotes. If they can stay healthy, they'll be contending for winning the Pacific. Yes, I'm 100% serious. And I agree with him. He's on the right track here. If the Coyotes can stay healthy, which in years past they haven't been able to do, but now this is a team that, if all goes well, they'll be in the playoffs. I'm very confident about that.
Right, and I think maybe the only comment I would sort of add to it is the beauty of this lineup creator is that you can edit everything in here, and so when you go through it, you can see which parts of the lineup are killing you, and you can see which parts are your strengths. And so, one thing that you can work with is I have the time on ice percentage on the side, and I have it default set to, around what the league average for line 1, line 2, line 3 would be. And so it defaults to that, but those can all be changed. And so you can take a lineup and say, we're going to ride these stars, play them 40% of the time, and only divide the rest up between the other three lines and really maximize the impact of your top group. And so, to wind it back to, say, the Rangers, for example, if I have Panarin on my top line, all of a sudden Zibanejad's a good player, depending on who they ride in the right wing spot on that top line. If you dial up the time on ice percentage there, all of a sudden the team's looking, a lot better because you're not looking for Nemesnikov or Ryan Strome or whatever, some player like this, to try to carry any load. And so there's sort of ways that you could maybe game the lineup creator in a sense by dialing up the time on ice and finding the problems on your roster and eliminating them. And one of the other things that I think is useful here is you can look through and say, Mark Stahl has been basically a pylon on defense for a couple of seasons.
True. And that's true.
And you take him out of the roster and all of a sudden you've answered a question on defense. And so for me, when I'm working with these lineup projections, at first I was making optimal rosters, going through and saying, if everybody was guided purely by stats, here's how the lineup would look arranged in the best order. But I did a couple of those and I thought, this isn't realistic and this isn't even fun in a way because we're not operating in the realm of, what we'll truly see. And so instead, I've forced myself to stick to Cap Friendly's depth charts, which do some things that, aren't optimal. Mark Stahl winds up being in your top 4. And is that realistic for the Rangers next year? I think that it sadly is. If you could fire him and his contract into the sun, you do help your defense a lot. And if he
maybe
plays
just his contract, I don't want to kill the man. But if he, I don't want him on the blue line. But like, I'm not trying to, burn him to a crisp here. I don't know what your plan is, but his contract is one thing. But I mean, I don't have a problem with Mark Stahl, the human being. I mean, I don't know what. Maybe he killed your cat. I don't know what Mark Stahl did to you. But I don't like his contract. But I don't have a problem with Mark Stahl, the person.
You've talked me into it. So Stahl, the human, can stay. But we're going to send the contract up to the sun. But right, and so if you take out every team's biggest problems and optimize their roster, all of a sudden everybody looks really smart, and we know that's basically the entire idea behind hockey Twitter. Teams are going to do dumb things, they're going to do suboptimal things, and that's what keeps us around talking about all the things they should be doing. So I agree. There's iterations of this Rangers and the Coyotes and many other rosters that will look a lot better on paper than they're going to look on ice once you get coaches making lineup decisions and throwing Mark Stahl, who we haven't burnt to a crisp, back out on the ice.
I mean, there's a lot of questions right now in terms of for the Rangers. There's a lot of questions like Mark Stahl's contract, and hopefully we're not throwing him into any sun anytime soon. But there are still a lot of questions regarding that. What's one team that you are projecting that is definitely either on either side of the spectrum here? One team that you think will be a lot better, and one team that you think will just completely plummet and just won't do anything at all this season?
I guess, one team that kind of surprised me when I was going through my initial projections, and, again, caveat, these have time to change. One team that surprised me was Dallas. I have them hanging around the top 5 in the NHL, and that's really, really high. War projections, when you're working with goalies, that matters a lot. Teams that have great goaltending perform well because goalies are on the ice the whole game. And if you have strong starters and strong backups like Dallas does, that can do a lot to sort of boost you up. And so, when I look through Dallas's roster and what they're likely to actually skate out there, it surprised me that they, looked as strong as they did. But, I like a lot of the players that they have there. Ben, Sege, and Radulov are, truly positive contributors still. Pavelski probably still has something left in the tank. They've got a really interesting defense. Heiskanen's awesome. John Klingberg is one of the better defensemen in the league. And then, there's just no arguing with Ben Bishop and Anton Khudobin. If they look anything like last year, it does set Dallas up in a good spot. But, we know Dallas really didn't sort of convert on that potential last year. And so I'm skeptical a little bit of how high they wind up in my projections. I think they're probably a little higher than they should be, but, here we are. The other, I guess, going in the other direction, a team that surprised me because they didn't look as strong as I thought they might is the Colorado Avalanche. I have them projected to be kind of in the same situation they were last year, hanging around that maybe last playoff spot, maybe even missing the playoffs. And I think a lot of people are riding pretty high on Colorado after the success that they had in the playoffs last year. They've got a young team, an exciting team. Bringing in Nazem Kadri looks great. They kind of, brought in a full second line with Donskoy and Burakovsky coming in as well. Cale Makar really looked exciting on defense. And so I think, there's a lot of buzz around this team as an up-and-comer. But the defense for me, when I project them forward, has a lot of question marks still. They're relying on some young players on the one hand, and then players like Zadorov and Eric Johnson whenever, he's healthy and playing for sure. They're relying on some, players like that who might not necessarily be impactful. And then there's some, just sort of blank spaces in the forward ranks too, the likes of Matt Calvert or Matt Nieto or Colin Wilson or Bellemare, another player they brought in, players that aren't expected to tip the scale majorly in either way. And so in the end, Colorado, I thought, this is probably a playoff team in the West, maybe a team that's got some improvement coming, but I don't project it yet. I've got them in the same spot as last year. And, I'm you never know when you're in July what things will look like in October, but it's a team that wouldn't surprise me if they outperform what I'm saying right now.
Couple of quick thoughts here before I let you go, Sean. This has been an absolutely great conversation. I appreciate you coming on. Your projections, I would like your projections and thoughts on the Sharks, who have lost Pavelski, currently are sitting without Joe Thornton. We don't know where he's going to go. This is a team that doesn't have a good goalie. I'm sorry, Sharks fans, but Martin Jones is, I don't know if you watched him play. He's not very good. You have a D-core with Vlasic, who's slowing down very, very considerably and very rapidly. He did not have a good year last year. And you have Erik Karlsson with his massive contract. He's playing on one leg for a lot of the time. There's a couple of holes there. The offense, as I said, has a couple of holes now. And do you still think this is a deep team, the Sharks? And also the Islanders obviously surpassed all and more expectations last season, but now with Leonard gone, is this going to be a playoff team, or are they going to revert to being a bottom feeder?
So the Sharks first, I agree, and the data backs up what you're saying about Martin Jones. He was one of the most negatively impactful starters throughout the year last year. And at his age, don't project for him to get lots better all of a sudden. It happens, but it's not something that is the most likely outcome. And so as soon as you have big questions in goal, between Jones not being an impactful starter and then Arundel being a drag as the backup, as soon as you do that to a team, you're in trouble. It's hard to recover. I love lots of pieces that they still have on offense. Couture is great. Evander Kane can handle that kind of top line winger role. The Meyer contract was a really good one. He's a great player. Hurdle is a really impactful offensive player. I still, even though, Karlsson isn't young, and like you said, he's playing on a couple of cadaver legs at this point, he's still one of the best defensemen in the NHL, and you got Burns there too. So there's enough of a sort of disconnect between the problems and the good that this team kind of levels out as a maybe 8 seed coming out of the West. I have them projected at 93 points. And so it's a team that hasn't fallen all the way out of the playoff picture yet, but they really flirted with it. And it's something that it could go either way. You get an injury to Karlsson, which wouldn't be surprising, or an underperformance from one of their top line players, and this is a team that's out of the playoff picture. On the other hand, you add Joe Thornton back in. Even at his age, if he's playing in a sheltered role and doing some power play work, he's still a positive contributor. He nudges them forward just a little bit still, and maybe again you're looking at an 8 or 7 seed. But it's certainly not the powerhouse team that we've gotten used to seeing the Sharks being. And if they make the playoffs, I don't see this as a long run, mostly because, without a goalie to really lean on, you're sort of sunk in this league. The other team you mentioned is the Islanders. That was a team where, I sort of got into approximately 1 million Twitter debates last year where Barry Trotz came in and kind of brought the Washington system with him, where they were allowing themselves to be outshot and out-chanced in terms of expected goals, but they were beating the odds by really converting on their own opportunities. And then they just had a mind-numbingly excellent season from Robin Lehner, which I wouldn't suspect we see again, especially from Semyon Varlamov. And so it's a roster that I have projected to drop off considerably out of the playoff picture for sure. I have them in the mid-85, sort of 85, 84-point range. I think that's probably fair. I do like parts of the roster still. Anders Lee is an incredible goal scorer. Barzal is, a really exciting young player in the roster still. They've got some pieces on defense who look like they could be real players at the NHL level too. But Varlamov and Greiss is not a great place to be in terms of net minding, and they really overperformed last year. So, even if they just settle back to where we'd expect them to be, it probably means they're out of the playoff picture in the East. And it could be a really, sort of a rough season for them without a lot of hope because, there's a lot of pieces in this roster, especially the bottom 6, the depth players, and, Leddy and Boychuk on defense. A lot of problems on this roster that might sort of, come to a head if this team isn't really overperforming like they did last year.
I remember a few years ago, the Islanders were using Matt Martin, Casey Zizekas, and Cal Clutterbuck on the fourth line. and people were calling it, the best fourth line in hockey or whatever. Daily Faceoff hasn't projected as the third line. And if your fourth line is projected to be your third line, that's a problem. I don't, this is not rocket science here. If your 10th, 11th, and 12th forwards are projected to be your 7th, 8th, 9th forwards, that's not great. It's not good, and you need depth. You need it real bad. And their fourth line, according to Daily Faceoff, of course, is Ladd, Komarov, and Ho-Sang. Ho-Sang, I'm shocked he's still on that team, considering how much they seem to butt heads constantly. Even though last year or the year before, I can't remember, he did well for the most part in the limited action that he played, and they sent him down anyway. So I'm still surprised that he's even on the Islanders, to be honest with you. The fact that, he hasn't been traded yet or demanded a way out or one way or the other is shocking to me. But if your fourth line is projected to be your third line, there are significant problems that your roster has.
Yeah, and Martin, Cizikas, and Clutterbuck as a fourth line is fine because it's not typically you're looking at 15 to as high as maybe 20% of your even strength ice time will go to a fourth line, 15%. That's not much. And so you just need players that can kind of, go around and be that kind of energy line. And those three show that they could do it. But, to your point, if you move those guys up to your third line, all of a sudden they're playing, mid 20% time on ice. That's an issue. It's going to expose them to much better competition over the course of a season. And then, for the fourth line, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see Andrew Ladd ever again. I agree that Josh Ho-Sang is probably the most likely to be traded player in the NHL besides Rasmus Ristolainen maybe at this point. And so working off the cap-friendly depth charts, I have Ross Johnson, Komarov, and Kuhnhackl as that fourth line.
Which is still a huge yikes. That's right, a huge yikes.
It's horrifying to look at, and it really does drag down everything else that the forward group can do. 'Cause, there's other players there that are decent contributors. But, like you said, I think the best way to think of it is, the best fourth line in hockey shouldn't be your third line. And that's the, sort of best case scenario the Islanders are going in to start the season with. So you get an injury or something isn't working out, and all of a sudden you've got Clutterbuck on line 2, Cizikas on line 2. Those sorts of things happen during the season. That really exposes your lack of depth quickly. And I think, the Islanders are in that kind of situation where they're, just an injury away or a poor turnout away from looking maybe really bad really quickly.
I agree. I definitely agree. Sean, this has been an excellent conversation. I truly appreciate you taking the time to talk some hockey with me. Plug your social media, plug your Patreon, plug everything you want to plug. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Well, I guess I would just say, any listeners out there, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Charting Hockey. I promise to fill your timeline with lots of graphs and lots of tools that you can use to, sort of have hockey arguments online with your friends. I do keep a website, my Tableau page, which is linked in my bio on Twitter. So you can go check out my Tableau page for all the charts that I keep updated daily. And then I do keep a Patreon account too. And if you want to, sort of keep me caffeinated during the season as I keep these charts updated, I really appreciate all the people that chip in a few dollars there too. So you can find my Patreon there. And, thank you in advance if that's something you're able to contribute to.
Sean, this has been excellent. Again, truly appreciate taking the time. I'll talk to you again real soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. This has been episode number 58 of Chel Squared. Number 59 coming out next week. I'll talk to you then.